Each individual's identity is comprised around multiple characteristics that come together in the formation of self. However, there are certain markers which seem universal in society's classification of difference. We call these markers social identities, typically defined as the portion of an individual's self-concept derived from perceived membership in a relevant group. Our social identity is constructed through a belonging to distinct categories, under such groups as religion, gender, race, language, sexual orientation, and class. Oftentimes, it is one's subscription to these groups which fuels their overall sense of pride and self-concept. However, a belonging to certain marginalized identities can prove less beneficial. It seems the most popular example of our society's mistreatment surrounding social groups arises from that of race.
All minority races have been through hardships in terms of their schooling and everyday experiences. There has been discrimination and segregation all throughout history. Here is a look into what unique experiences some races had. First off, Asian Americans experienced a combination of racism and economic exploitation that resulted in particular educational policies. These policies were designed to deny Asians schooling or to provide segregated schooling. The educational experiences of Asian Americans have paralleled with African Americans and Native Americans. Next, African Americans were constantly pushing to get an education. Unfortunately, ex-slaves and African American people in general were not provided an education. They were forced to create their own schools, districts, teachers, and curriculum. This push for education made for a change in universal schooling, ultimately leading segregation to diminish in the United States. Next, the Latino population have faced a number of struggles as well. In the earlier days, there was more of a focus on changing their culture rather than teaching academics and public education. An example of this is they prohibited speaking Spanish in schools and hired teachers who did not know Spanish well. Classes were taught in an American perspective. Segregation was also prevalent in this community. Latino children were educated in separate and unequal school facilities. The facilities were small and lacked in curriculum. This curriculum was imbalanced and placed children in slow or low ability groups. In higher education, people doubted them because of their race. About 10% of ethnic Mexicans graduated high school. Finally, the last minority I will be discussing are Arab Americans. Their history is fairly current. It should be known that it is stereotypical to assume that all Arab Americans are Muslim. After 9/11, Arab Americans were greatly affected in schools. They were seen as terrorists and were physically or verbally harassed in schools. People assumed anyone who had features of a stereotypical Muslim was a terrorist. Many parents would keep their students home from school so they would not be bullied. Girls wearing hijab were especially bullied a lot in school. The only steps taken to diminish discrimination against Arab Americans and Muslims in schools included encouraging students to form anti-discrimination or diversity communities.
Systematic racism continues to impact the lives of minority populations, even in our current state. We see this sort of oppression play out through troubling practices such as redlining, in which financial services are denied to specific neighborhoods based upon their racial and ethnic composition. As a consequence of redlining, neighborhoods that local banks deem unfit for investment are left underdeveloped or in despair. This type of discriminatory action undoubtedly perpetuates the disenfranchisement of those living in diverse areas. In addition to the oppressive forces which impact housing, one may also notice those which currently impact our educational system. Perhaps the largest one we've seen, as a result of service learning, revolves around unequal school funding. It is known that nearly half of the funding for public schools in the U.S. is provided through local taxes, generating large differences between wealthy and impoverished schools. Such disparities seek to maintain a gap in academic achievement between schools that are better off and worse off. Sadly, we often see the schools that are categorized as worse off are highly populated by minority students.
Social class encompasses many different aspects of our lives that will have a significant impact both in the short run and the long run. It impacts many areas such as the type of school you attend, the opportunities and resources you have or lack access to, and what your view of a normal day in life is. Growing up in a middle-class township, you expect certain things that many people never have access to. Schools that are well-funded make it possible to have access to AP courses, a wide range of electives to help you explore your interests, extracurricular programs, an abundance of supplies, and so much more that makes higher education become a logical next step. There are also many pressures that you are not faced with, such as luxuries of having enough food to eat, always feeling safe, and so much more. When you grow up in lower income areas, the hardships that children face from a very young age are something that they see as normal but was drastically different from our experiences growing up. In many of these lower income schools, children may occasionally meet with a specialist, but it is usually up to a general education teacher to cater to a wide range of needs and abilities within a classroom. This forces children to teach based on state or national standards, not allowing children to fully reach their potential if they're at the top or the bottom of the range. They also do not always have access to electives such as something as simple as gym, music, or art, since these are the first programs that will be cut due to a lack of funding. In many ways, children attending these lower income schools are put at a large disadvantage in the long run without even being given a chance to reach their full potential from the start. In many cases, children are faced with the added stress of having rough home lives, violence, drugs, and having to work to help support their family from a very young age. Not all of these families support their exploration of their interests, and so much more that hinders their ability to further their education and move up in society.
Discrimination is not allowed in schools today, and all kids are to be given the same chance, although we still see it in our schools today within many aspects, such as how much money is given to each school to spend per pupil, the education level of teachers, and the materials and resources that the school has to offer for their students. I will be looking at a few of the differences of Brighton High School versus Howell Public Schools. I grew up going to Howell Public Schools and then changed school districts to Brighton Public Schools, which was the town over from me when I was in 6th grade, so I had a chance to experience both school districts. I've pulled some demographics from each of the school's districts' high schools, and here are some of the statistics such as dropout rates, where Howell has a higher percentage than Brighton, graduation rates, where Brighton has a higher percentage than Howell, ethnic distribution that is about the same in both towns, and some socioeconomic details where we see Brighton being in a higher social class with fewer students being eligible for free lunches than Howell. As you can tell from some of the demographics and some of the pictures shown of the sites on the high schools, Brighton was overall more privileged than Howell in multiple ways. Even though not by much, Brighton's overall socioeconomic status is higher than Howell, which in return puts Brighton students at an advantage. Being underprivileged in schooling will in the long run end up putting you at a disadvantage in life, and this is when we see a poverty cycle that is college affordability and accessibility affecting our job opportunities, and then in return affecting our socioeconomic status. In my service learning experience, I have observed the demographics in which I mentioned earlier from 2 schools I attended. Since my service learning was the Boys and Girls Club of Lansing, which multiple schools in the Lansing area attend, I decided to look up the demographics of Everett High School, which is in Lansing, and this is what I found. They have an average dropout rate of 17.1%, which is about 13% more than the schools I mentioned earlier. Their graduation rate is at a steady 66%, which is 22 to 30% lower than Howell and Brighton. Their ethnic distribution is 43% Black, 23% white, 18% Hispanic, and 9% Asian. And lastly, we see about 50% of their students being eligible for free lunches. In the end, it doesn't matter about what resources and materials we are given as teachers. It mainly matters that we give each student an equal chance at success in our classrooms every day.